Hello, my name is Daria Gorshenina and I was born in Russia. And I've been living there for 20 years. And I'm afraid of police in my country, especially after the story about Ivan Golunov, when police officers threw drugs to the journalist and were trying to imprison him for about 20 years. So today I'm in the US, in Burlington, Vermont, and I think it's the best chance to compare American police to Russian police. There is a system in Russia. According to it, the work of the police is evaluated by the number of crimes they have solved. The more criminals are caught, the more chances to a salary increase and land a promotion. Unfortunately, it doesn't lead to effective work, but to falsification of crimes and arrests of innocent people.
I do not believe that there are a rash of instances in which people are, to use a colloquial term, railroaded into the prison system. There have been. There are stories from Chicago, there are stories of individual officers who abuse their authority and individual prosecutors who abuse, of individual judges who, in Pennsylvania, there was an instance of a judge who was essentially selling delinquent kids to a prison system that he was somehow monetarily associated with. I don't know if he was a board member or not, I don't recall it. Those are known, those become stories that have national resonance because they are exceptions to the rule, and they're stories that get a lot of attention because they are rarities.
In Russia, the salary of an ordinary police officer makes up 40,000 rubles, or close to $600 a month. It's a pretty low salary. That is the reason why taking bribes is extremely common.
My salary, I'm happy with my salary. It could be bigger, sure, but I'm happy with it. But I want my officers to be paid better. And I want my officers to be paid better because they earn it and they do the work. They do very, very difficult work. And they don't do it for the money. They do it because they have in them a desire to keep their neighbors safe. Our officers make a good deal more than that. A senior police officer here, I believe, is making, under our new contract, I'd have to double check, but it's higher than 40. It's a good deal higher than 40. I want to say it's about 70, and about 80 for sergeants, and about 90 for lieutenants. And that's without overtime and other kinds of incentives that can be added to compensation.
2 years ago, domestic violence was decriminalized in Russia. It means that if a husband hits his wife, he will bear only administrative responsibility. He will just pay a fine and come back to his wife, and may continue to abuse her. Police do not work with such situations. Crisis centers, which were created by numerous NGOs for people who suffered from abusive relationships, are overwhelmed in all Russian regions.
That is something that we struggle with. We struggle with it in Vermont. We struggle with it in Burlington. It is a hidden crime. It can often go unreported. It can go unnoticed, even by neighbors or by family members. When it is found, we have a domestic violence officer, a specifically tasked officer here. She is incredibly dedicated to her role. She is there to make certain that a patrol officer may encounter the crime first because of a call for service. Neighbors hear fighting in the apartment next door. Neighbors hear violence in the apartment next door. Officers respond. They see signs of violence on, again, most of the time we'll say that it's the female partner, and they then interview her. They take the male into custody. But sometimes those cases can fall through the cracks. What the domestic violence officer is able to do is make certain that a strong case is built. So it's not just about that one incident that the officers responded to. The domestic violence officer will interview the victim, will compile a case that talks about previous instances, will talk about instability in the relationship or in the home, talk about whether or not that violence has also gone against other family members, and build a very strong case in order to make sure that it can be followed through on by our partners in the prosecutorial realm, so that the attorneys who take over the prosecution of the case and put it in front of a judge. And by doing that, we're really able to make sure that every domestic violence case that comes to us is is followed through on as vigorously as possible. There's also a program called DV-STAT or KidStat, where our officer gets together with counterparts at other police departments in the county and also with other agencies that deal with people who are having these kinds of family traumas. And that may be mental health experts, that may be people who can assess the children's condition through the Department of Children and Families, which is our version of something that in other places is called Children's Services, or it's sometimes called, Family Services. A number of these stakeholders gather around a table once a month and they discuss individual cases, and they say, this is a case where we see X and Y and Z. We see a suspect or a perpetrator who's done it a number of times. What kinds of resources are we giving to the victim? What kind of resources are we putting in place to make sure that other people in the family are protected? Are we working with the perpetrator as well to try to find alternatives for that individual, whether there are substance abuse issues there, whether there are mental health or anger management issues there, and try to really address those problems in a way that is putting the victim first, but also attempting to find out what the causes underneath are so that you can solve the problem beyond merely arresting someone and having that individual be released or even go to jail for a short period of time, but then return to the same relationship and the same dynamics that end up causing violence and harm to someone.
According to Russian law, a police officer can use a firearm when he protects himself or citizens from danger. It is pretty obvious and common in most countries. Also, the abuse of using firearms by police is an exception to the rule. At the same time, Russian citizens can possess firearms as well. However, this pleasure is overpriced. At first, a person who desires to get a firearm must pay a special tax, then pass a medical check and mandatory training. On the other hand, the black market, where it is possible to buy a firearm illegally, increased dramatically. This phenomenon exerts directly on the number of crimes. The rate of crimes that happened with using a firearm climbed by 30% over the last 5 years, and now accounts for more than 5,000 crimes.
Well, I don't use a weapon every day at all. In fact, I've never used my weapon in the course of work, and most police officers do not use their weapons at all. Television and movies paint a very different picture of how often police officers use force. Very different. There are approximately 800 to 1,000 instances in which police officers kill a person in the country. And that data comes primarily from the Washington Post. We don't have a federal source of that data, which is a problem that the FBI has lamented. Former FBI Director Comey had a real problem with the fact that our federal data was not tracking the numbers in an accurate way. For a long time, the federal government said there were about 400 to 450 instances in which officers shot and killed a person. And we know it now to be at least double that, and not much more. It's between 800 and 1,000 a year. The majority of those are instances in which people are shooting at police officers or they are shooting at other people. We don't have a lot of gun crime here. You can buy a pistol very easily in Vermont. Vermont has some of the least restrictive gun laws in the entire country. In fact, the governor only just added some new laws that restrict gun ownership and the types of things that can be owned. But prior to that, Vermont, unlike most states, had no law about carrying. You could carry it openly, you could carry it concealed, you could buy it without a background check. There were all sorts of things that you could do in Vermont that were lawful. Background checks are federally regulated, but the state had really no laws about gun ownership. And so there are a fair number of guns in Vermont. I would say that the majority are associated with sport, with hunting, etc. They are not things that are used in most of our crime. We don't see a lot of gun crime in the sense of shootings where people are struck by bullets. We thankfully do not see very many homicides by firearm, although the one homicide that we have experienced in 2019 was a firearms-related homicide. But considering the prevalence of guns, we don't see attendant crime committed with guns. That's not the case everywhere in the United States.
Today, I compared only a few areas of police work, and I don't want to say that the American police are better than the Russian ones. There are advantages and disadvantages of work for each side. Nevertheless, I cannot mention that the main difference between them is a relation to the law. There is a rule of law in the US. In Russia, as the practice release, the law can be ignored, and I hope that this situation will change. In Burlington, I am Daria Gorshenina.